We like to think that we're good people. We believe that if someone ordered us to do something terrible, we would be able to resist. But what if we can't? What if we actually did commit terrible acts when ordered to? That's exactly what happened in the famous Milgram experiment. In this video, we're going to answer one of humanity's biggest questions. Why would ordinary people choose to commit terrible acts? To find out, Yale University's own Stanley Milgram recruited 40 men from the local area in New Haven, Connecticut. They were paid for their time, and some were even given an electric shock machine to take home. All of them were told that they would be paid whether or not they took part in the experiment. What these men didn't know was that they had been split into two groups, teachers and learners. The other half were told that they were going to be the teacher, while the rest would be learners. In reality, both roles were played by actors, but the participants didn't know this. Both groups were given a test run so that they understood how the final experiment would work. When it came for real, the learner was strapped to a chair with electrodes attached to them. Meanwhile, the teacher was given a shock generator. Their job was to ask the learner a series of basic questions, such as what is the capital of France? When they got an answer wrong, the teacher was meant to hit the shock button, increasing the voltage every time they gave a wrong answer. The higher the shock, the worse the consequences. Initially, the shocks were relatively mild, but they ramped up quickly. Before the experiment began, the learner begged the researcher to turn off the machine, claiming that he couldn't handle any more pain. He explained that he had heart trouble. Despite this, the researcher simply ignored him and waved to the teacher to start the experiment. What happened next shocked Milgram. He expected about 20% of the participants to give the highest shock, but almost double that number did. 65% of the participants continued to press the shock button, even after they heard the learner screaming in pain. Even more shocking than that, though, is that 75% of the participants reached the highest possible shock, which was labeled danger. Severe pain will occur. It was supposed to be a fake danger sign, but to the participants, it looked very real. And yet, they still pressed the button. To make matters worse, the pain wasn't only imagined. After the experiment, the researchers checked the learner's body for signs of pain. There were none. This meant that each participant had really hurt the other person. If that's not evil, then we don't know what is. So why did these men behave so badly? Well, according to Milgram, it came down to 4 reasons. Let's take a look at them one by one. Reason No. 1. Authority pressure overrides our personal morals. Each participant was given a speech by the head researcher before the experiment started. In it, he emphasized the importance of the study and said that it would be a crime if they stopped it. Then, when the experiment started, the researcher stood right next to the teacher, watching over them. With the researcher present, no one questioned his authority. But when they were left alone with the learner, 369 of the 40 participants hesitated. They felt uneasy about hurting the other person, even if it was all in the name of science. But ultimately, they followed the instructions and delivered the shocks. No. 2. People fear disobeying more than they fear harming. Throughout the experiment, the participants could hear the learner getting more and more upset. At first, he made jokes, but then he became serious. When he was shocked for the second time, he said, "Please, Mr. Subject, I don't want to be in this experiment anymore." The third time, he cried, "I won't be a guinea pig for you." And the fourth time, he screamed, "Stop. Please, please stop." From that point on, the learner only protested by screaming. However, despite all those pleas, the participants kept pressing the button. It seems that Milgram's subjects were afraid of breaking the rules more than they were afraid of hurting another person. 3. Responsibility shifts. Now, as we mentioned earlier, all of the participants felt uncomfortable during the experiment. They felt guilty for hurting another person. However, once it was over, most of them were ready to defend their actions. They argued that they weren't hurting the learner, but the researcher was. How they saw it, they were just helping the researcher collect data. They claimed that if they hadn't participated, the researcher would have found someone else to carry on the experiment. In other words, they absolved themselves of blame and placed it on the researcher. Interestingly, the participants were more likely to accept responsibility if the learner was in the same room as them. When that was the case, 40% said that they would feel responsible for what happened to him. As we mentioned earlier in the video, each participant thought that they were there to teach the learner something. However, when they arrived at the lab, they were told that their instructor wouldn't be there that day. Instead, they were greeted by a man who introduced himself as a fellow researcher. The two men discussed the experiment for a few minutes before they met the learner. During that conversation, the fellow researcher praised the experiment and told the participant that he should be proud to be involved in it. Unsurprisingly, this fellow researcher was actually another actor playing a role. But his presence showed the real participants what behavior was expected of them. In fact, having another person present increased the number of participants willing to give the highest possible shock by 30. Now, if you're wondering, the Milgram experiment was repeated many times over the years. The participants came from different backgrounds and different places. For example, some were American, while others were German. Some were high school students, while others were full-grown men. Despite that, the results were always the same. Around 60% of the participants gave the maximum shock. It seems that we can't escape the darkness that lies within us. Sometimes the best way to prove that darkness doesn't exist is to walk towards it. From the time we're born, we're encouraged to be kind, helpful, and caring. But if we become adults and start working for an organization, those values can get lost. That's what happened to the workers in the Soviet Union who starved millions to death during the Holodomor. It also happened to the German citizens who allowed Hitler to come to power. We might think that we read too smart to fall for a dictator's promises or a manipulative recruiter's sales pitch. But the truth is that we're all susceptible to social pressure. The fact is that most of us want to be liked. We want to fit in and move forward in our careers. As a result, we can easily convince ourselves that slavery isn't that bad, or that discrimination isn't such a big deal. While we should never judge the past by today's standards, it helps us understand how terrible things can go wrong. It reminds us of the importance of thinking critically and questioning those in power. Sadly, though, most of us don't learn that lesson, and instead we keep doing what we're told, even if it's evil. So what can we do about that? Well, some believe that we need to focus on bringing up kids who aren't afraid to question everything. Others believe that we need to reward people for speaking out rather than punishing them. Either way, it's clear that we shouldn't admire people who follow orders without thinking, because those are the people who allow evil to thrive. The bottom line is that most people aren't bad. They just obey orders. It's not easy to resist social pressure and speak out against those in power. But if we don't try, evil will continue to survive. Now, are you interested in similar topics? We've linked a couple of videos on the screen that we think you'll like. But if you want to know more about how evil survives, then click here. Thanks for watching.